At 1:47 p.m. on December 20th, 1943, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler lifted his Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter from the runway at Oldenburg Airfield in northwest Germany, climbing toward bombers that had just attacked Bremen and were now heading home to England. Stigler, a 28-year-old Luftwaffe fighter ace with 27 confirmed kills, needed one more victory to earn the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration for aerial combat. One more bomber shot down would give him the medal, the recognition, and the status that came with being a Knight's Cross recipient. His radar controller radioed coordinates for a target, a lone B-17 bomber, separated from its formation, flying low and slow, heading northwest toward the North Sea. Stigler acknowledged, adjusted his course, and accelerated toward where the bomber should be. A lone, damage bomber was the perfect target. Easy kill, minimal risk, certain victory. He would shoot it down, return to base, and receive his Knight's Cross before Christmas. Simple. Except when Stigler found the B-17 at 1:52 p.m., flying at approximately 1,000 feet altitude barely above stall speed, he saw something that made him hesitate. The bomber's entire tail section was shredded by fighter attacks and flak. The vertical stabilizer nearly shot away. The right horizontal stabilizer was hanging by metal shreds, barely attached. The fuselage was riddled with hundreds of holes. He could literally see through the aircraft in places where aluminum skin had been torn away. One engine was completely destroyed, propeller windmilling uselessly. Another engine was smoking, likely minutes from failure. The nose plexiglass was shattered. And in the tailgun turret, a body hung motionless. The gunner clearly dead. Stigler flew alongside, close enough to see inside the bomber through the damaged fuselage. He saw the pilot, a young American, struggling with the controls, blood on his face. He saw the co-pilot slumped unconscious in his seat. He saw crew members in the waist section tending to wounded, one man with what appeared to be half his face blown away. He saw that this wasn't a bomber anymore. It was a flying coffin carrying 10 men who were somehow still alive despite the aircraft being so damaged it shouldn't be capable of flight. Stigler thought about his teacher, Hauptmann Gustav Rödel, who had trained him as a fighter pilot in North Africa. Rödel's words echoed in his mind. "You are fighter pilots first, last, always. You fight enemy aircraft. You do not murder airmen attempting to survive. If I ever see or hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. Honor matters more than victories." The crippled B-17 wasn't fighting. Its guns weren't manned, the tail gunner was dead, the waist gunners were tending wounded, the top turret was destroyed. Shooting this bomber wouldn't be combat. It would be murder. The pilot was struggling to keep the aircraft flying, not attempting to fight. And these men, whoever they were, had already survived what looked like impossible damage. They had earned the chance to try making it home. Stigler made a decision that would haunt him for 47 years, wondering if it had been courage or cowardice, honor or weakness. He pulled alongside the bomber's left wing, close enough that the pilot could see him clearly. He pointed toward Germany, then pointed down, surrender, land in Germany, become prisoners. The American pilot shook his head no. Stigler pointed north toward Sweden, neutral territory where the crew would be interned but safe. The pilot shook his head again and pointed northwest. England, home. Stigler understood. These men were going to try for England or die trying. He could shoot them down and claim his victory, or he could let them go and never speak of it. There was a third option. He could escort them to the coast, use his fighters' presence to prevent other German fighters from attacking, and give them a chance to reach the North Sea where German fighters couldn't follow due to fuel range. Stigler chose the third option. He flew formation on the bomber's left wing, his fighter clearly visible to German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground, who would see a Bf-109 escorting a B-17 and hold fire rather than risk shooting down one of their own fighters. He stayed with the bomber for approximately 30 minutes, flying it past German flak positions, past German fighter bases, all the way to the North Sea coast, where Allied territory began just 60 miles across the water. At the coast, Stigler pulled alongside one final time, caught the American pilot's eye, and saluted. Then he rolled his fighter away and headed back toward Germany, knowing he had just committed an act that could result in his execution if anyone learned what he'd done. The bomber continued toward England, its crew never knowing the name of the German pilot who had spared them, but knowing they owed their lives to his mercy. If you want to, see how one German pilot chose honor over victory, and how 50 years later the American he saved found him and became his lifelong friend. Hit that like button. It helps us share these stories of humanity in warfare, when killing would have been easier. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the most famous act of mercy in WWII air combat, and the reunion that proves some bonds transcend war. Back to December 20th, 1943, and a morning raid that went catastrophically wrong. The mission began at 6:30 a.m., when Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old B-17 pilot from West Virginia, attended the briefing at Kimballton Airfield in England for his first combat mission as aircraft commander. The target was Bremen, Germany, a major industrial city with factories producing U-boat components and other war material. Bremen was one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany. The city and approaches were protected by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and multiple Luftwaffe fighter bases that could scramble interceptors within minutes of Allied bombers being detected. Brown's B-17, nicknamed Olde Pub, was a standard B-17F flying fortress. 4 1,100 horsepower Wright Cyclone engines, wingspan of 103 feet, length of 74 feet, maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds, armament of 1350 caliber machine guns, and bomb load capacity of 8,000 pounds. The crew consisted of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, top turret gunner, radio operator, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and tail gunner. The formation of over 300 B-17s took off beginning at 8:45 a.m., climbing to bombing altitude of approximately 27,000 feet. The flight to Bremen took approximately 2 hours, the bombers flying in tight formation to maximize defensive firepower from their combined machine guns. Each bomber carried approximately 8,000 pounds of bombs, a mix of 500-pound and 1,000-pound high-explosive bombs intended to destroy Bremens. Factories, shipyards, and rail infrastructure. German radar detected the formation shortly after crossing the coast, and Luftwaffe fighters began launching to intercept. The bomb run over Bremen occurred at approximately 11:15 a.m. under intense flak. German anti-aircraft guns firing shells that exploded at bomber altitude, creating deadly shrapnel patterns. The flak was so thick that pilots described it as, "You could walk on it." The sky filled with black bursts, each burst representing an exploding shell sending shrapnel in all directions. Olde Pub took several flak hits during the bomb run. One shell exploded close enough to the left wing that shrapnel penetrated the fuel tanks, causing leaks that would later threaten fuel supply. Another shell burst near the tail section, damaging control cables and creating the first holes that would later be enlarged by fighter attacks. A third shell damaged hydraulics in the landing gear bay, destroying the hydraulic system that controlled gear, flaps, and brakes. But the bomber completed its bombing run successfully, the bombardier releasing the bomb load at 11:16 a.m. from 27,000 feet altitude. The bombs fell for approximately 45 seconds before impacting Bremen's industrial district. Then the formation turned northwest for the flight home to England, and the real terror began. German Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters attacked the formation as it turned for home, concentrating on bombers that were damaged or separated from formation. Standard Luftwaffe fighter tactics involved attacking from the nose. Head-on attacks where combined closing speeds exceeded 500 miles per hour gave bomber gunners minimal time to track and fire at attacking fighters. The Germans would fire cannons and machine guns while diving toward the bombers, roll away at the last moment to avoid collision, then climb for another attack pass. Olde Pub, already damaged by flak, was flying slightly lower than the main formation due to damage to one engine. This made it a target. German fighters always attacked stragglers first, because stragglers had less defensive firepower from nearby bombers. At 11:47 a.m., a Bf-109 attacked from 12 o'clock high, diving from above and ahead, its 20mm cannons and machine guns firing. Brown saw the fighter approaching, saw the muzzle flashes, and waited for the impact. Tracers streaked past the cockpit, then shells hit. The first 20mm shell struck the nose plexiglass directly in front of the bombardier, Lieutenant Robert Andrews. The shell exploded on impact, the blast throwing Andrews backward and filling the nose compartment with shrapnel and plexiglass fragments. Andrews was hit by shrapnel in the shoulder and face, the wounds bleeding but not immediately fatal. The navigator, Lieutenant Al Sadak, was hit by fragments in his leg and chest, more serious wounds that would require immediate first aid to prevent death from blood loss. More shells struck the cockpit area. One shell penetrated the cockpit windscreen directly in front of Brown, the explosion creating a gaping hole that let freezing air blast into the cockpit at 27,000 feet, where outside temperature was approximately -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Another shell struck the co-pilot's position, hitting Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke in the face. Luke died instantly, his body slumping forward against the controls, his weight on the control yoke pushing the bomber's nose down toward a dive. Brown, temporarily stunned by the explosion and the blast of freezing air, realized the aircraft was diving, pulled Luke's body off the controls, and fought to regain level flight. The aircraft dropped approximately 2,000 feet before Brown recovered control, the dive increasing airspeed dangerously close to structural limits that might have torn the wings off. He leveled at approximately 25,000 feet, assessed the damage, nose destroyed, co-pilot dead, controls responding sluggishly, and tried to rejoin the formation. A second fighter, identified by crew members as a Focke-Wulf FW-190 attacking from above, raked the aircraft with machine gun fire beginning at 11:49 a.m. The burst started at the top turret, killing Staff Sergeant William Lloyd, who was manning the twin 50 caliber machine guns. The bullets continued along the fuselage, penetrating aluminum skin, damaging structural members, and hitting the No. 3 engine. The engine's cylinder heads were struck, destroying the engine's ability to produce power and causing it to catch fire from ignited fuel and oil. Brown immediately activated the No. 3 engine's fire suppression system, a CO2 system that flooded the engine cowling with carbon dioxide to smother flames. The system worked, extinguishing the fire, but the engine was destroyed and useless. Brown feathered the propeller, rotating the blades edge-on to the wind to reduce drag, and compensated for the loss of power by increasing throttle on the 3 remaining engines. But the No. 4 engine, hit by the same burst that destroyed No. 3, was smoking from damaged fuel lines, leaking fuel onto hot engine components. Brown couldn't shut down No. 4 because losing 2 engines on the same wing would create asymmetric thrust that would make the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. He left No. 4 running despite the smoke and fire risk, hoping it would continue producing power long enough to get them home, or at least to the coast. At 11:52 a.m., a third fighter, crew members in the waist section, believed it was another BF-109, attacked from 6 o'clock low, the standard tail attack position. Tail gunner Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode engaged the attacker with his twin 50 caliber tail guns, firing approximately 150 rounds before the German fighter's 20mm cannons fired back. One shell struck the tail turret, penetrating the thin armor and exploding inside the cramped turret where Eckenrode was sitting. The explosion killed Eckenrode. Instantly, the shrapnel and blast trauma unsurvivable in the confined space. The same burst that killed Eckenrode also destroyed the tail's control surfaces. The vertical stabilizer was nearly severed, hanging by a few structural members that flexed with every gust of wind. The right horizontal stabilizer was shot almost completely off, connected only by control cables and a few metal fragments. The rudder, used to control yaw and coordinate turns, was so badly damaged it barely responded to Brown's foot pedals. This was the damage that would make the aircraft's survival impossible, according to engineering analysis. The tail surfaces, vertical stabilizer, horizontal stabilizers, rudder, and elevators, are essential for aircraft stability and control. Losing most of the tail surfaces should have made the aircraft instantly unstable, entering an uncontrollable spin or tumble. That ye olde pub remained controllable defied aeronautical principles, suggesting either Brown's exceptional pilot skill or divine intervention or sheer luck. Brown ordered his crew to prepare to bail out, but when he looked back through the damaged aircraft, he saw crew members tending to wounded. At least 5 men were injured too badly to bail out safely. The navigator, Lieutenant Al Sadak, had been hit by shrapnel and was bleeding from multiple wounds. The bombardier, Lieutenant Robert Andrews, had been wounded in the shoulder, several waist gunners were injured, and the ball turret gunner, Sergeant Samuel Blackford, was trapped in his turret because the hydraulic system that rotated and extracted the turret had failed. Brown faced an impossible choice: bail out and save the unwounded crew while abandoning the wounded who couldn't survive parachute jumps, or attempt to fly the crippled bomber back to England and risk everyone dying in a crash. He chose to try for England. He kept the aircraft flying through sheer pilot skill, manually trimming the damaged aircraft to maintain barely controlled flight, nursing the 2 remaining engines, and heading northwest toward where he hoped the North Sea and England lay. This was when Franz Stigler found them at 1:52 p.m., 87 minutes after the fighter attacks had left Olde Pub as a flying wreck barely capable of staying airborne. Stigler had been scrambled to intercept bombers, had landed to refuel after his first sortie, and was now flying a second sortie hunting stragglers. His orders were explicit: shoot down enemy bombers, particularly damaged bombers separated from formations. Every bomber destroyed meant fewer bombs dropping on German cities, fewer civilians killed, fewer factories destroyed. Shooting down bombers was his duty, his job, his purpose as a fighter pilot. But when Stigler pulled alongside and saw the damage, saw the dead tail gunner, saw the wounded crew struggling to survive, saw the pilot fighting to control an aircraft that shouldn't be flying, something in him refused to pull the trigger. He later described the moment. I saw the gunner in the back was dead, his body hanging there. I could see through the holes in the fuselage. I could see members of the crew helping each other. One had half his face shot away. They were not combat crew anymore. They were just human beings trying to get home. Stigler thought about Gustav Rödel's teachings. Rödel, his squadron commander in North Africa, had been adamant about honor in combat. Rödel had shot down multiple enemy aircraft, but had also refused to engage damaged aircraft attempting to reach safety. Rödel's philosophy: fighter pilots fought other fighters and bombers that were combat effective. Shooting crippled aircraft attempting to escape wasn't combat. It was assassination. Stigler also thought about his own brother, August, a Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down and killed earlier in the war. August had been flying a damaged aircraft attempting to reach home when enemy fighters had shot him down, despite his aircraft. Being clearly incapable of fighting, Stigler had learned of his brother's death and had felt rage at the enemy pilots who had killed a man in a crippled aircraft. Now he was in position to do the same thing to someone else's brother. He made his decision. He pulled alongside Olde Pub, close enough that Brown and the remaining crew members could see him clearly. The crew panicked. A German fighter alongside meant imminent attack, meant death. They scrambled for their guns, but most guns were damaged or empty of ammunition. Brown waved at his crew to hold fire. Shooting at the German would provoke return fire, and they'd lose any chance of survival. Stigler pointed toward Germany and made a landing motion. Surrender, land your aircraft, become prisoners of war. Brown shook his head no. Prisoners meant surviving, but it also meant abandoning the mission to get his crew home. He had wounded men who needed medical treatment that German POW camps might not provide adequately. And surrendering meant failure, meant not completing his duty to bring his crew and aircraft home. Stigler pointed northwest towards Sweden, approximately 400 miles distant. Sweden was neutral. Landing there would mean internment rather than imprisonment, better treatment, eventual repatriation. But Sweden was too far for the crippled bomber. With 2 engines damaged or destroyed, fuel leaking from bullet holes, and the aircraft barely controllable, they'd never make 400 miles. Brown shook his head again and pointed directly north. England, approximately 60 miles across the North Sea from the German coast. Stigler understood immediately. The American pilot was going to attempt reaching England or die trying. It was perhaps 1 hour's flight at the bomber's reduced speed, assuming the damaged engines held out, assuming the aircraft stayed together, assuming they didn't encounter more fighters. The odds were terrible, but they were better than the alternatives. Stigler could shoot them down. His Bf-109's armament consisted of 2 7.92 mm MG-17 machine guns mounted in the engine cowling, firing through the propeller arc, 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns mounted above the engine, and one 20mm MG-151 cannon firing through the propeller hub, Total firepower, approximately 1,200 rounds per minute from the machine guns, plus the cannon's explosive shells. Against an undefended bomber, this firepower would be devastating. One 5-second burst would be sufficient. The machine gun bullets would shred the already damaged aluminum structure, while the 20mm shells would explode inside the fuselage, killing anyone they hit. The bomber couldn't evade. It was flying at approximately 155 miles per hour, barely above its stall speed of 140 miles per hour. Stigler's fighter could reach 360 miles per hour. The bomber couldn't outrun him, couldn't outmaneuver him, couldn't fight back effectively. The tail gunner was dead, the top turret was destroyed, and the waist gunners were either wounded or tending to wounded crew members. Shooting this bomber would be the easiest kill of Stigler's career, and it would earn him the Knight's Cross he needed. Or he could let them go. Simply break away, return to base, report that he'd found nothing, and allow the Americans to attempt their escape. No one would know he'd spared them. His ground crew might question why his guns hadn't been fired, but he could explain that away. Mechanical problems, targets out of range, various excuses that would be accepted without investigation. The bomber might crash on its own. It was so badly damaged that reaching England seemed impossible, and his mercy wouldn't cost Germany anything, because the bomber would die anyway. Or he could do something unprecedented, escort the bomber past German defenses, protect it from other German fighters, and give these men the best chance possible to survive. This was actively helping the enemy, treason by any definition, punishable by execution. German. Military law was explicit. Aiding the enemy during wartime was capital offense, prosecutable by summary court-martial, with execution often carried out within hours of conviction. If anyone discovered what he was doing, if another German fighter spotted him escorting an enemy bomber, if ground observers reported a Bf-109 flying formation with a B-17, if his squadron commander questioned why he'd expended no ammunition, he would likely be shot. But this was also the most honorable action, the choice that aligned with Gustav Rödel's teaching that honor mattered more than victories. Stigler thought about Rödel's words that had guided him since his training in North Africa. You are fighter pilots first, last, always. You fight enemy aircraft that are fighting. You do not murder airmen who are helpless. Honor is what separates warriors from murderers. Stigler thought about his brother August, shot down while flying a damaged aircraft trying to reach home. August had been flying, a Bf-109 that had been hit by Allied fire, one engine damaged, controls barely responding, attempting to nurse the fighter back to his base. Allied fighters had found him, had seen his aircraft was crippled, and had shot him down anyway despite his inability to fight back. When Stigler learned of August's death, he'd felt rage at the Allied pilots who had killed a defenseless man. Now, he was in exactly the same position, facing the choice to kill someone else's brother who was defenseless and trying to get home. Stigler made his decision. He later described the thought process. I couldn't shoot at them. It would have been like shooting at a man in a parachute. They were out of the fight. They were helpless. Shooting them would have been murder, not combat. I thought about Gustav Rödel's teachings. I thought about my brother, and I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be. I decided that being an honorable man was more important than being a decorated ace. He chose escort. He pulled his Bf-109 into formation on the bomber's left wing at 1:55 p.m., positioning himself approximately 30 feet away, close enough that Brown and the crew could see him clearly through the damaged fuselage. The proximity was deliberate. Stigler needed to be close enough that ground observers would clearly see a German fighter escorting what they would assume was a captured or surrendering bomber. At this distance, anti-aircraft gunners wouldn't risk shooting at the bomber because they might hit the German fighter. The ruse worked. Flak batteries that would have fired on a lone Allied bomber held fire when they saw the German fighter alongside. From the ground, the sight of a Bf-109 flying formation with a B-17 could only mean one thing. The bomber had surrendered and was being escorted to an airfield to land. German anti-aircraft doctrine prohibited firing on aircraft being escorted by friendly fighters. Stigler's presence acted as a shield, his fighters' markings telling every German gunner below to hold fire. The flight toward the coast took approximately 30 minutes, covering roughly 75 miles at the bomber's reduced speed of approximately 150 miles per hour. During this time, Stigler maintained formation, adjusting his throttle to match the bomber's speed. Flying his fighter at 150 km/h was dangerously close to stall speed for a Bf-109, requiring constant attention to maintain control at such low airspeed. He flew without his oxygen mask despite being at altitude where oxygen was normally required, because he wanted Brown to see his face clearly, to see that he was human, that this was a deliberate choice by a person rather than some abstract action by an enemy. Several times during the escort, Stigler looked into the bomber through the holes in the fuselage. He could see crew members moving around inside, could see them tending to wounded, could see their desperation as they struggled to keep their friends alive. He made eye contact with one waist gunner who was staring at him through a hole in the fuselage. The gunner looked terrified, probably expecting to be shot at any moment. Stigler waved at him, a gesture meant to communicate that he wasn't going to shoot, that they were safe. The gunner looked confused but waved back hesitantly. Stigler also noticed that the bomber was leaving a trail, not smoke from engines, but a fine mist that he recognized as fuel vapor. The bomber was losing fuel from bullet holes in the tanks, the fuel evaporating as it leaked and creating a visible trail. This meant the bomber had limited fuel remaining, possibly not enough to reach England, depending on how rapidly the leaks were draining the tanks. But there was nothing Stigler could do about that. The bomber either had enough fuel or it didn't, and only time would tell. At one point during the escort, Stigler pulled ahead of the bomber and gestured toward his own aircraft, then pointed down. He was trying to communicate that he was going to leave soon, that he had to turn back due to fuel limits. Brown apparently understood, nodding and waving acknowledgement. The communication was primitive, just hand signals and gestures, but it worked. Both men understood that the escort would end at the coast. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the crew's understanding of the situation evolved slowly. Initially, when the German fighter first appeared, they had panicked thinking they were about to be shot down. When the fighter didn't shoot but instead flew alongside, confusion replaced panic. Some crew members thought the German was calling for reinforcements to finish them off. Others thought the German might be trying to force them to land in Germany. But as minutes passed and the fighter continued flying alongside without attacking, without calling visible reinforcements, and without attempting to force them down, some crew members began to understand that something unusual was happening. Navigator Al-Sadak, despite his wounds, was maintaining awareness of their position and direction. He noted they were heading toward the North Sea, away from German airfields, away from places where forcing a landing would make sense. He told Brown, "I think he's helping us. I don't know why, but I think he's actually helping us escape." Radio operator Richard Peachout suggested monitoring German radio frequencies to see if the fighter was calling for help. They listened, but heard nothing directed at their position. The German fighter was maintaining radio silence, not calling for assistance, not reporting their position. This supported Sadok's theory. If the German intended to call for help, he would have done so already. Tail gunner position was occupied by Eckenrode's body, but waist gunner Alex Yelisenko moved to a position where he could observe the German fighter and the tail section. He reported, "The fighter's just flying alongside. He's not doing anything hostile. And sir, you need to see this. Our tail is barely attached. I can see daylight through holes where the vertical stabilizer should be. I don't understand how we're still flying." This observation, that the bomber was so badly damaged it shouldn't be flyable, helped the crew understand why the German wasn't shooting. They weren't a threat anymore. They were helpless. And apparently, this German pilot had principles that prevented him from shooting helpless enemies. At approximately 2:22 p.m., they reached the German coast at the North Sea. Beyond the coastline was open water, then England 60 miles distant. German fighters couldn't escort them further. Fuel limits meant Stigler needed to turn back immediately, or risk not having enough fuel to reach his base. This was where the escort ended. Stigler pulled alongside the bomber one final time, positioned where Brown could see him clearly through the shattered cockpit windows. He made eye contact with the American pilot, this young man he'd never met and would never see again, this enemy who he'd chosen to spare. Stigler raised his right hand in a formal salute, a gesture of respect from one pilot to another. Acknowledgement that what had happened here was beyond normal warfare, was something that transcended enemy status. Brown, understanding the gesture, even if he didn't understand the reasoning, returned the salute. For a brief moment, these two men, one German, one American, enemies by national allegiance but connected by the choice that had just been made, acknowledged each other as human beings rather than targets. Then Stigler rolled his Bf-109 away, turned back toward Germany, and was gone within seconds, disappearing into the distance. Olde Pub continued toward England, struggling across the North Sea, the crew waiting for the damaged engines to fail, or the damaged tail to collapse, or the aircraft to simply disintegrate from accumulated damage. The flight across the North Sea took 45 minutes. Brown maintained altitude at approximately 1,000 feet high, enough to potentially survive a water ditching if engines failed, low enough to conserve what little power the damaged engines could produce. They crossed the English coast at approximately 3:07 p.m., but the ordeal wasn't over. With hydraulics failed, Brown had no landing gear, no flaps, no brakes. He'd have to belly land the bomber on an airfield, hoping the damaged tail would hold together during landing impact. Brown aimed for the nearest airfield, an RAF base at Seething. He called the tower, reported his situation: no hydraulics, no brakes, 2 engines damaged, control surfaces barely functional, and requested emergency landing clearance. The tower cleared the runway, positioned fire trucks and ambulances, and watched as the crippled bomber approached. The landing occurred at 3:21 p.m., 5 hours and 36 minutes after takeoff, 7 hours since Brown had woken that morning for his first mission as aircraft commander. Brown brought the bomber in as slowly as possible, maintaining control until the last moment, then dropped the aircraft onto the runway in a controlled crash. The bomber scraped along the runway on its belly, metal shrieking against concrete, the damaged tail section collapsing partially, the aircraft sliding approximately 800 feet before stopping. The crew evacuated immediately, helping wounded members out through damaged sections of the fuselage. Ground crew and medics rushed to the aircraft, removing the most seriously wounded for immediate medical treatment. When everyone was safely out, Brown looked back at his aircraft and couldn't believe it had flown. The engineering team that inspected Olde Pub counted over 400 bullet and shrapnel holes in the aircraft's structure. Every major system had some level of damage. The fact that the aircraft had remained airborne for over 3 hours after the fighter attacks defied aeronautical engineering principles. The crew was debriefed about their mission, their combat, their miraculous survival. Brown mentioned the German fighter that had escorted them to the coast. Intelligence officers were skeptical. Why would a German fighter escort an enemy bomber instead of shooting it down? Brown insisted it had happened, that the German pilot had deliberately spared them and escorted them to safety. The intelligence officers recorded the account, but classified it as unverifiable. There was no evidence beyond Brown's testimony, and the story was so unusual that confirming it seemed impossible. Brown was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his piloting skill in bringing the damaged aircraft home. His crew members received decorations for their actions during the mission. But the story of the German fighter pilot who had spared them remained classified, not because it was secret, but because no one knew what to do with information about enemy mercy in the context of total war. Franz Stigler, meanwhile, landed at his base at approximately 2:45 p.m., taxied his fighter to its revetment, and shut down the engine. His ground crew asked why his guns hadn't been fired. They'd expected him to return with empty ammunition after intercepting bombers. Stigler told them he'd found nothing, had searched, but the bombers had already left the area. This was a lie, but a necessary one. Admitting he'd found a bomber and let it go would have resulted in immediate investigation. Stigler never told anyone what he'd done. Not his squadron commander, not his fellow pilots, not anyone in his family. The secret stayed with him for 47 years, hidden because revealing it would have meant admitting treason, admitting he'd valued enemy lives over German victory. In 1944 Germany, where total war demanded total commitment, such admission would have been interpreted as defeatism at best, betrayal at worst. Stigler continued fighting for the remainder of the war, achieving additional victories, surviving being shot down multiple times, and ending the war with an estimated 28 confirmed kills, one more than he'd had when he encountered Olde Pub. He received the Knight's Cross after achieving his 28th kill in early 1944, but he always knew that his most important action had been the one that didn't count as a victory, the one where he'd chosen mercy over decoration. The war ended in May 1945. Stigler, like millions of Germans, tried to rebuild his life in devastated post-war Germany. He immigrated to Canada in 1953, settling in British Columbia, where he worked as a businessman and tried to leave the war behind. But the memory of the damaged B-17 and the young American pilot stayed with him, a moment that defined his sense of who he was and what he valued. Charlie Brown, meanwhile, returned to combat flying, completing his required 25 missions, and returned to the United States in 1944. He left the military after the war, got married, pursued a civilian career, and tried to forget the terror of that December day when he'd nearly died over Germany. But, like Stigler, the memory stayed with him. Specifically, the memory of the German pilot who had spared them for reasons Brown couldn't understand. In 1986, 43 years after the encounter, Brown decided to try finding the German pilot. He had no name, no identification, only the memory of a Bf-109 with yellow markings flying alongside his bomber. He wrote to a Combat Pilot Association newsletter asking if any Luftwaffe pilot remembered sparing a B-17 on December 20th, 1943. The letter was circulated among veteran organizations, forwarded through networks of former pilots, and eventually reached someone who suggested Brown contact Franz Stigler in Canada. Brown wrote to Stigler in 1989, describing the incident and asking if Stigler was the pilot involved. Stigler received the letter and read it with emotions he couldn't fully articulate: relief that his decision had resulted in survival, vindication that his choice had been right, and fear about revealing what he'd done even 46 years later. But he also felt compelled to respond, to finally tell someone what had happened and why. Stigler wrote back, confirming he was the pilot. He explained his reasoning: the bomber had been defenseless, the crew had been trying to survive, not fight, and Gustav Rödel's teaching about honor had guided his decision. He revealed that he'd never told anyone about the incident, that it had remained his secret for nearly 50 years because he'd feared the consequences of admitting he'd spared enemy airmen. Brown read Stigler's letter and immediately called him. Their first phone conversation lasted over 3 hours, two elderly men separated by the Atlantic, but connected by a moment that had defined both their lives. They discovered they lived only a few hours apart. Brown in Florida, Stigler in British Columbia. They arranged to meet in person in 1990. The reunion occurred at a hotel in Seattle. Brown and Stigler, two men in their 70s who hadn't seen each other since December 20th, 1943, met in the hotel lobby. Brown recognized Stigler immediately despite the decades. Something in his face, his bearing, his eyes, matched the memory of the German pilot who had saluted him through a shattered cockpit window. They shook hands, then embraced, both men crying, releasing emotions they'd carried for 47 years. They spent the next 3 days talking, sharing their experiences, filling in the details of what had happened from each perspective. Stigler explained how he'd made his decision, how Gustav Rödel's teachings had influenced him, how he'd lived with the secret for decades, wondering if he'd been a coward or honorable. Brown explained how the bombing mission had gone wrong, how his crew had struggled to survive, how they'd wondered for years who the German pilot was and why he'd spared them. They discovered profound connections beyond the incident. Both had lost brothers in the war. Stigler's brother August shot down by enemy fighters. Brown's brother killed in ground combat. Both had experienced the trauma of combat, the survivor's guilt, the complicated emotions of victory and loss. Both had tried to leave the war behind, but found it impossible to fully forget. From 1990 until their deaths in 2008, Brown and Stigler became close friends. They visited each other regularly, attended aviation events together, and co-wrote their story in a book called A Higher Call, published in 2012. They gave joint interviews to documentaries and historians, explaining what had happened and why it mattered. They became advocates for the principle that honor in warfare was possible, that humanity could exist even between enemies, that some choices transcended national allegiance. Their story became famous within aviation communities and military history circles as perhaps the purest example of mercy in combat. It demonstrated that even in total war, individual choices mattered, that honor could outweigh duty, and that one person's decision could ripple across decades, affecting lives in ways impossible to predict. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, at age 92 in Canada. Charlie Brown died on November 24, 2008, at age 87 in Florida, 8 months after Stigler. Their joint obituaries noted their combat encounter and lifelong friendship, describing how a German pilot's mercy and an American pilot's survival had created a bond that lasted until death separated them. December 20th, 1943 was when Franz Stigler found a crippled B-17 and chose mercy over victory. 1:52 p.m. was when he decided not to shoot. 2:22 p.m. was when he saluted and flew away. 1986 was when Brown began searching. 1990 was when they reunited after 47 years. 2008 was when both men died within 8 months, their shared story proving that some bonds transcend warfare, and that one choice to spare life echoed across 7 decades. One German pilot, one American bomber, one decision that risked execution, one escort to safety, 47. Years of silence, one reunion, 18 years of friendship, proved that honor exists even in total war, and that mercy creates bonds stronger than enmity. Not because war makes mercy easy, because choosing mercy when duty demands killing defines who we are more than any victory ever could. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of humanity and warfare when humanity seemed impossible. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who chose mercy over duty and proved that some bonds transcend nationality. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.